All right, our next presenter is Carol Swain. Carol, could you please come forward while I talk a little bit about you? Carol is a retired professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt University. She has written no less than 8 books. If you just sit over here, and then I'll give you the podium. If you just sit right there. Yeah, great. She has written no less than 8 books, including one on the subject of white nationalism. But notwithstanding that, and her distinguished academic career and the fact that Carol happens to be black, about 9 years ago she found herself suddenly under attack and labeled an apologist for white nationalism on the front page of the Daily Tennessean in Nashville, Tennessee, courtesy of our friends at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Today, Carol runs the Be the People Foundation. She writes and she does podcasts on a range of public policy issues. You can read a lot more about her in the handout about our speakers. But before I turn the microphone over, I just want to add that Carol is a true American success story. She was born into poverty and very tough family circumstances, but she pulled herself up through her own hard work and determination to overcome those and many other obstacles, to have a distinguished teaching career and do a great deal of good in this world. Carol, we are truly honored to have you with us today. You bet.
Thank you. In case you overlooked it, today is Sunday morning. And that means that all across America in churches, there are people today that are praying for Brett Kavanaugh, and they're also praying for Christine Ford. And even though I'm here to talk about the Southern Poverty Law Center, you can't talk about the Southern Poverty Law Center without talking about the liberal left and the activists and the Democrats, because it's the same tactics being used against Brett Kavanaugh that were used against many of you all when you were smeared by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And so I would like to use part of my time to acknowledge the pain that we're suffering in this country over the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh. And there is a war on Christians, and there is a war on conservatives, and unless we are able to get a handle on what's taking place today in America, we lose America. And some of the things that I have been doing that are fairly recent is that I'm writing for the Epoch Times now. And that's a newspaper that was founded in China about 25 years ago by John Wang. He was one of the students that was fired upon at Tiananmen Square. And the newspaper's been sold. It's based in New York now, but I have written several columns about Brett Kavanaugh, Christine Ford, and just this war on everything that's American. And so I would encourage you, if you want to know what I've been doing as far as my writing, I've been very active because it frightens me, and it should frighten everyone, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, that we are at this point in our history where people can make allegations unsubstantiated 30, 40 years ago, and there's no way for a person to defend themselves. And the mistake was made when not enough conservatives got behind Roy Moore. And whether you hated Roy Moore, didn't agree with him, thought he was the looniest thing, the fact that we did not fight for due process, the presumption of innocence, and all those things that have made America America. We didn't fight for that. I mean, there were conservatives that helped bring down Roy Moore, and in the process, they set the stage for what's taking place today against Brett Kavanaugh and what will take place against every conservative. Many of you are interested in immigration. The second edition of my book, Debating Immigration, was released by Cambridge Press in late August, and it has more essays. There are a number of original essays. There were 5 written by me. I decided to have a stronger voice in my own book, including my own version of what a truly comprehensive immigration plan should look like. And so I have a few copies here. I would encourage people, if you're interested in immigration, and it's called Debating Immigration because there's more than one viewpoint. So I have a spectrum of views, conservative as well as liberal. There are many faculty, individuals from Princeton, various universities across the country. And it's something that the last edition was used all over the world in classrooms. It would be very helpful to me if you would order copies, read the copies, review the copies, especially on Amazon. As of today, there are no Amazon reviews, and that would be important to get it reviewed by Amazon. And the level of the book is for an educated layperson, and so that means that it can be read by ordinary people, but also policymakers and students and just various people that are interested in immigration. So with that done, we can talk about the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I'm sure that for the people in this room, you're not strangers to the Southern Poverty Law Center. There's nothing here that I could tell you that would surprise you. And the fact that they went after me in 2009 because I wrote a blog for the Huffington Post, and at that time, I was writing for the Huffington Post, and I had not completely made my transition from being a Democrat, to being a Republican. And the title of my article had to do with mission creep and how the Southern Poverty Law Center had deviated from its original mission because, if you go by the narrative, and so for purposes of this conversation, I'll pretend that they were started with noble goals to fight the Klan. They deviated from that. And so probably at around 2005, I don't know when they went after a fair, I know when they went after the Center for Immigration Studies, but 2005 was when they first started going after some Christian groups. 2007, I was a commentator for Lou Dobbs CNN, on immigration mostly, and they started going after Lou Dobbs, and that was part of why I wrote the article, because they had gone away from hate groups to smearing individuals. And so there were a number of individuals who were active in the area of immigration that started getting smeared in 2007, and that's why I wrote the opinion piece. So it was summer of 2009, I wrote my opinion piece in the Huffington Post. By October, and I don't remember, it was late September or early October, that was when I found my picture on the front page of the Tennessean with, on that front page, somewhere on that front page, and I can't remember how they had it set. I thought it was the headline, but it wasn't the headline, but they called me an apologist for white supremacy. And I was labeled as an apologist for white supremacy because I had reviewed a film titled A Conversation About Race. And the young man who produced the film, A Conversation About Race, he had asked me to review the film. I watched the film on its own merits. And I watched it as a professor, as a faculty person, and I've taught courses on race. And, how many times can you show the eyes on the prize? I mean, I show the eyes. When I was a professor, I always showed the eyes on the prize, but I thought it would be fascinating to expose the students to a different viewpoint. And in A Conversation About Race, this young man had gone around and interviewed people of all different races and ethnicities. In fact, there are probably more liberal whites in the film than there are blacks or any other group. And he asked them to define racism. And you can imagine, like, if you stick a microphone in any of our faces, just cold, we might stumble. Unless you've had a lot of experience, you're going to stumble. And so when people tried to define racism, they gave all these vague definitions, and then he would say, but they all said it was everywhere. You can't escape it. It follows me around. I see it every day. But then he said, okay, well, give me an example. And that's when people really stumbled. And you saw people, stretching for examples. And some of the things that made people seem silly was, so there was a black woman, she was asked, give me an example of racism, and she said, well, when I go to the store, the sales clerk, they come and they say, may I help you? Well, we know what she means. Some of us know, what she meant, right? But she obviously felt like that they were following her around because she was black. But I go to, to the store and I want someone to say, may I help you? I wander all around, Home Depot or wherever I'm going, and there's no one to help me. And there was a black man that said he dated white women and he could see people looking at them out of the corner of his eyes. But they went on. So the film was just mostly asking people, what is racism? Define racism. And then the filmmaker says, that racism is something used to beat up white people. Then he talks about his own story. And so as a faculty member, who normally every film out there presented race in one particular perspective, I thought that this was a great opportunity to have some classroom interaction and to just show that, there are two sides to every argument, two sides to every issue. So I gave that film an enthusiastic review. And so the Southern Poverty Law Center said the filmmaker was a racist. I don't know if they labeled him a white supremacist, but he had gotten into some type of back and forth internet exchange with someone attacking him, and that he had called President Obama a name. Maybe he called President Obama a monkey or something like that. But then at the counter that other people were pointing out was that George Bush was called everything under the name, including, a monkey and worse. And so that was why they labeled me as an apologist for white supremacy. That was their reason for doing it. And at that time, I did not have the platform I have today, so it meant that I was attacked locally as well as nationally. I could not turn on the radio, certainly black or urban radio, without hearing my name being discussed, and people mocking me, but no one was calling me, asking me to come on the show and give my side. And finally, Tom Joyner, invited me to be on his show, and I gave my side. But what really saved the day was James Taranto at the Wall Street Journal. Like, he knew me, and he knew about my work. He wrote a 2,000-word article. Now, in journalism, 2,000 words is a long article. So, and so he, the title of that article is In Defense of Carol Swain. It took 2,000 words to defend me, but but that backfired on the Southern Poverty Law Center. And like Kathleen, I like to take credit. I would take credit for being responsible for the beginning of the end of people beginning to scrutinize the Southern Poverty Law Center. Because when they went after me, and at that time I had published 2 books on white nationalism. 2002, The New White Nationalism in America, Its Challenged Integration. And for people who have read that book, I take credit again, Kathleen. I take credit for having been the person that predicted the rise of the alt-right. Because when I called it the new white nationalism, I was describing something that was not old-style white supremacy. That these guys were well-educated, they were articulate, they were citing social science data, statistics, and science to make a case for white people to organize the same way other groups organize. They were not espousing violence. And so I knew that they had the potential to reach into the mainstream white population because they were pointing to double standards, to racial double standards. and some of the leaders. And, you know, Jared Taylor lives around here among you, those who live in Northern Virginia. And so, you know, he was one of the persons I had interviewed. And he's a perfect gentleman in interactions, you know, educated at Yale, London School of Economics. And so he was putting forth a case that very much turned everything the political left was doing. It took it to its logical conclusion, in the sense that multiculturalism says that every group ought to be able to celebrate their heritage and their pride and who they are. And Jared Taylor, you know, pretty much pointed out every group except whites. And with identity politics, I mean, it's encouraging people to embrace their identity, but then you say every group except whites. And then some of the people who would fall into this category that I would call, I call it the new white nationalists, and I would call now the alt-right, they were people that might argue that discrimination is wrong. White people are being discriminated against and no one's standing up for white people. I knew that that would resonate with the mainstream population. And so my book, published in 2002, was a warning, because I felt like the way to get around this was to move away from identity politics and embrace the American national identity, that was the only way out. Because if you take the arguments of the liberal left to their logical conclusion, you end up with white interests and white identity. And so I saw that the liberal left had given the language and the ideology that would create what we call today the alt-right. So that was 2002. 2003, I published the interview transcripts of the interviews with the white nationalist leaders. And that second book was co-authored with my interviewer, Russ Neely, who at the time was a preceptor at Princeton. So that's part of my background, and that did not insulate me from being called an apologist for white supremacy. And when I published my book on white nationalism, I cited the Southern Poverty Law Center hate group data, but I also cited individuals who questioned how they collected that data. The fact that they seemed to have a methodology that every year they had to inflate the numbers, even if it meant counting post office boxes in the same group several times. And so they were not thrilled with the book for that reason, nor were they thrilled with the book because in my concluding chapter where I make policy recommendations, I broke my recommendations into recommendations for the nation as a whole and recommendations for black people. And so I felt that we had a shared responsibility. But I said in that book, in the concluding chapter of the New White Nationalism, that white interests and white identity would be the next phase for identity politics in America. And so that's a little bit of the background. Now, I'm limiting myself to 7 reasons that we should beware of the Southern Poverty Law Center, but you know that there are more reasons than 7, right? But we can't be here all day. And one of the most serious reasons would be that they ignore just basic standards of scientific research when they classify hate groups and also individuals. And they have a vague definition, and they also have a methodology that it always includes conservative or Christian groups. It never includes liberal groups. George Yancey, a University of North Texas sociologist, did a study of them, and he said, and the title of this study was Watching the Watchers. He said that their methodology seemed more geared to mobilizing liberals than cataloging hate groups. And if you look at their methodology, a good professor at a top-tier university would not accept their methodology in an undergraduate research paper, much less a PhD dissertation. Another thing is the Southern Poverty Law Center uses guilt by association to engage in attacks against individuals. And so it's not necessarily the individual. If you are, one reason we're not, and I'm assuming one reason KC is not photographing the people in the audience that ask questions is that if you were photographed, you would be guilty of whatever this group is guilty of by the definition of the Southern Poverty Law Center. So it's to protect people from guilt by association. And so all you have to do is be friends with someone or show up at certain events, and all of a sudden you're guilty. And that's part of how the political left has operated in the past. And many of us know that the Southern Poverty Law Center's labeling has inspired acts of violence against conservatives. And I find it interesting that Dr. Ford and just various liberals talk about being afraid. And someone wrote on Facebook that I wonder if she thinks she's testifying against the Clintons. Because it's not the conservatives that you have to be afraid of, yet every one of us and any one of us, once we are publicly identified as a conservative, we risk being in one of those situations where we're in a restaurant now and they shout us out of the restaurant, or we are, in a situation, a public situation, and we are harassed. We don't engage in that kind of behavior for the most part. Conservatives are well behaved. Perhaps they're a little too well behaved, but they're well behaved. And the Southern Poverty Law Center, they tend to ignore the threats posed by anti-American groups such as Antifa, ISIS, and the Muslim Brotherhood. The Southern Poverty Law Center ignores threats posed by leftist anti-American groups such as Antifa, ISIS, and the Muslim Brotherhood. We all know that. And Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, even when they were connected, whether you want to say loosely or strongly, with the shootings of the Dallas police officers, they still get ignored as hate groups. The Southern Poverty Law Center attacks and smears mainstream public organizations. This is churches, ministries, and various entities. Some of the groups that have been targeted include the American Family Association, Alliance Defending Freedom, Act for America, the Center for Immigration Studies, Center for Security Policy, the G. James Kennedy Ministries, the Family Research Council, Liberty Council, Traditional Values Coalition. Any group that's really effective should be on this list. And if your group is not on this list, I strongly question whether or not you're actually doing anything for America. So, that's a problem if your group is not on this list. And I'm not joking.
Just love you.
And when you're on this group, when you're on the list, when you make the Southern Poverty Law Center list, you wear that as a badge of honor. It's not a badge of shame. And if your board members don't know that, you need to educate them. The Southern Poverty Law Center labels groups and individuals. It's inspired acts of violence against its targets. And we know about the shooting at FRC a few years ago, as well as when Representative Scalise was shot. The person that shot him was someone that was a fan of the Southern Poverty Law Center. So again and again, we see ties with the Southern Poverty Law Center. And this Southern Poverty Law Center, I guarantee you that if you look at the lawyers and some of the people that are involved with the accusers of Brett Kavanaugh, if you link all the dots, you will find connections. And they are using tactics very similar to what the Southern Poverty Law Center started. But as I said at the beginning when I started speaking, that it's much more dangerous now because they've gone from, making loose connections to a place where now they have no need for any kind of evidence. And so I don't know how you fight back unless somehow you can educate the public about the Constitution, about our judicial system, about standards of evidence, and make everyone, whether they are Democrats or conservatives or where they stand on the ideological spectrum, help them to realize that they are potentially at risk. Because in that type of society, no one is safe. And the political left, we can count on them to overplay their hand. They will eventually eat their own, but in the meantime, we have to fight back. Thank you. His question has to do with whether or not I think the Southern Poverty Law Center is abusing loose ties with the Southern Christian Leadership Organization. And that was an organization that was one of the leaders during the Civil Rights Movement. And I can tell you, just being called the Southern Poverty Law Center is misleading because they do nothing about poverty. Everything they do is motivated by whatever topic will get money from the liberal left. And so, yes, I mean, they use black people. It's mostly a white organization. After they've been criticized by not having blacks in high positions, they have one or two tokens. But for the most part, it's white liberals doing what advances a white liberal agenda. And the attacks on the Christian groups and the traditional family groups, it's all about the LGBTGIAZOMAT movement. There was a gentleman here. Then first, he's one of the individuals who was interviewed in my book, The New White Nationalism in America. He has a PhD, and he is obviously well educated. He wants to know why, when he turns on the news or when he hears the talking heads, that the messages he gets would suggest that black people hate white people. Yet, in his everyday life, when he has interactions with black people, he finds that, you know, most people are just people. That we're just people. We open doors for each other, at least those from the South. And you know, and so I think that the problem is the leadership, that there are people that have a vested interest in keeping blacks and whites and blacks and blacks and Hispanics and Americans at each other's throats, and women against men. And we know with the Me Too movement, they have created a situation that if you have sons, I don't know what you're telling your sons about how to date. Like, I just don't know. I read that there's a new app that if you go out with someone, that they can use this app if there's going to be any type of sexual behavior, and they can text that they consent, so that later on, and this is, you know, this is problematic too, because you might be consenting to someone you think is normal, and then all of a sudden, after you say yes, they turn into some type of crazed maniac. But I mean, this is where we are in our society. But I think that most black people and white people, that we have more in common than we, than most people will. And we have a stake in reforming this nation. And a lot of the things that get characterized as being about race, it's really about social class. And all of this stuff about white privilege, I think that the whole privilege debate is about social class. You know, clearly Brett Kavanaugh and Christine Ford were very privileged Americans. And so that's about people that are affluent and what takes place in their world. One of the things I would like to see is for President Trump to stop nominating Supreme Court justices from the Ivy League exclusively. There are people that have degrees. There are people at other universities across America that would be fully competent, not competent, they are as qualified. Having a degree from the Ivy League should not be a qualification, the only qualification that counts for serving on the Supreme Court, but we seem to reach that point where if you're not from one of those selective schools, that you don't stand a chance of being appointed, and that shouldn't be the case. And there's something about the culture at those institutions that I think, there's something about the culture that's very problematic, even for conservatives that go there. And so there's a reason for us to do things differently. We can go back to affirmative action when it was established, and part of the arguments for affirmative action was to address the injustices against the past and present descendants of slaves. I mean, that was part of the argument, to do something about people that whose ancestors had been slaves. Anyone that studied affirmative action knows that from the very beginning, the benefits went to people who were more affluent and more elite. And so immediately, it was changed in such a way that the beneficiary class expanded to include just about anyone. I mean, 5 or 6 groups by 1970 were covered by affirmative action. And so if you make it the way it is now about diversity enhancement, then, there's no incentive that institutions have to address the problems of the descendants of slaves. And so it's made it more problematic. And if you go to American universities, especially the elite ones, a disproportionate number of the blacks there would be descendants of immigrants, or their parents would be immigrants, from Africa or the Caribbean, but they would come from more affluent families. And so it is problematic. But yes, identity politics, when you just look at black versus white and not look at the lineage, it creates a problem if you really care about justice. And so we hear people talking about social justice, but they have set up a system that benefits the affluent. And when you go to those college boxes, it's not about race anymore. I would say that the benefits now mostly go to people who can check the box that has to do with sexual identity. And there are students, sometimes they're black students, they don't want to check the box. If you're black and you don't check the box, or you could be Hispanic or some group that would be privileged by checking the box for college admission, that's imputed as white. So it's assumed. They put you in a box as white if you don't check the box. And when it comes to sexual identity, that's not something that anyone can check. And so, I mean, there's an incentive for people to game the system by checking the box. And there's a lot of advantages that go to checking the box. I think that's very problematic for us, and it's part of the direction our society has moved in. Yeah. The question was about the 14th Amendment, and that it was ratified to give citizenship to the newly freed slaves, and it was never meant to be a backdoor way to the U.S. My answer has to do with, given what's taking place in America today, where there's a presumption of guilt, where there's no due process, and where there are no rules of evidence, I mean, your question pales in comparison. We have more serious things to deal with. When we get America back, we will address your question. Thank you.